November 25th, 2018. A 26-year-old woman is decorating a Christmas tree with 3-year-old twins in Midvale, Utah. 60 seconds later, she is dead on the couch, and the person who killed her is sitting with the children. The divorce had been final 10 months. The new life was supposed to be the safe part. These are 10 ex-wives who murdered their new families. Case 1. Betty Broderick. La Jolla sits along the Southern California coastline just north of San Diego, a stretch of cliffs and coves where the median home price, even in the late 1980s, could buy a small neighborhood in most other parts of the country. The streets curve past hedges trimmed to right angles and driveways that disappear behind iron gates. In November of 1989, one of those driveways led to a house on Cypress Avenue where a man named Daniel T. Broderick III lived with his second wife, Linda. They had been married for less than 7 months. The house was quiet, the neighborhood was quiet, and on the morning of November 5th, both of them were found dead in their bed, shot with a revolver by someone who had let herself in through a door she still had a key to. The woman holding the gun was Daniel Broderick's first wife. Her name was Elizabeth Ann Broderick, though everyone called her Betty. She was 41 years old. She had 4 children with the man she had just killed, and by the time she pulled the trigger, almost everyone who knew her had been watching the situation build for the better part of 5 years. The story of the Broderick marriage stretches back to 1965, to a college dance at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. Dan was a 21-year-old senior. Betty was 17, a student at the College of St. Mary's. They met at that dance, and Dan pursued her with a focus that would define much of his personality in the years to come. He was driven, organised, methodical. Betty later described him as someone who decided what he wanted and simply refused to stop until he had it. They married on April 12, 1969, at a church in Tuckahoe, New York, just outside the Bronx. She was 21. He was about to begin medical school at Cornell. What followed was a stretch of years that Betty would later describe as the foundation of everything she believed she was owed. Dan attended Cornell Medical School, then Harvard Law School. Betty supported the household through all of it. She worked as a substitute teacher, she babysat, she managed the children, the moves, the daily logistics of a family living on almost nothing while one spouse chased degree after degree. The couple relocated multiple times during those years, from New York to Massachusetts, and eventually out to San Diego, where Dan launched his legal career. By the early 1980s, he had become one of the most successful malpractice attorneys in the city. His income climbed past $1 million a year. The couple bought a home in the affluent Coral Reef neighborhood of La Jolla. They had 4 children together. To most people on the outside, they had arrived. Betty threw herself into the role of a wealthy San Diego wife and mother. She hosted parties, she volunteered at schools, she drove the children to activities, maintained the house, and kept up appearances in a social circle where appearances were a form of currency. She would later say, and many of her friends would confirm, that she believed she had earned every dollar Dan made, that his career was built on the decade of sacrifice she had put in while he studied. Whether Dan saw it the same way is harder to pin down. What is documented is that by the early 1980s, cracks in the marriage had become visible to the people closest to them. Dan worked long hours. Betty felt isolated. Arguments became routine. In 1983, Dan hired a new legal assistant at his firm. Her name was Linda Kolkina. She was 21 years old, blonde, recently arrived from the Midwest with no legal background. Dan was 39. Betty became suspicious almost immediately. She later told friends and family that she confronted Dan about the relationship and he denied it. He told her she was being irrational. He told her she was imagining things. He told her Linda was simply an employee. But Betty was not satisfied by any of those explanations, and the tension between them accelerated. What happened over the next several years would become the subject of extensive court testimony, 2 television movies, a best-selling book, and eventually a 2020 limited series. The details are messy and deeply personal, and both sides told different versions for decades. But the broad outline is documented in court records and depositions, and it goes something like this. Dan moved out of the family home in 1985. He and Betty began what would become one of the most hostile divorce proceedings San Diego had ever seen. Dan was a prominent attorney with deep connections in the local legal community. Betty claimed that those connections made it impossible for her to find adequate representation, that lawyers were reluctant to go against someone who could damage their careers. Dan, for his part, argued that Betty was unstable and dangerous. He sought and received a restraining order. He gained custody of the children. Betty's behaviour during this period became increasingly erratic, and the record on that point is not in dispute. She left hundreds of profane messages on Dan's answering machine. She vandalised his home. She spray-painted the walls of his bedroom. She smeared food across his kitchen. On one occasion, she drove her SUV through the front door of his house. She was arrested and held for 72 hours on a psychiatric evaluation. She was found with a knife on her at the time. These were not the actions of someone coping well with the divorce. They were the actions of someone in freefall. Dan used every incident to strengthen his position in the legal proceedings. Each time Betty acted out, he documented it. Each outburst became evidence of her instability. He filed for contempt of court. He had her jailed briefly on more than one occasion for violating the restraining order. He reduced her spousal support. He kept the house. He kept the children. And by the time the divorce was finalised in January of 1989, Betty had lost nearly everything she believed she had spent 20 years building. There is a version of this story, the one Betty told for the rest of her life, in which Dan was the architect of her destruction. In her telling, he gaslit her about the affair, used his legal power to strip her of her children and her home, and left her with nothing, while he moved on to a new life with a younger woman. She described herself as a wife who had been thrown away, a mother who had been erased. And it is true that the legal system in this case favoured the partner who understood it best. Dan was a lawyer, Betty was not. He knew the rules, she did not. That imbalance shaped the outcome of the divorce in ways that are difficult to ignore. But there is another version too, the one documented in police reports and restraining orders and psychiatric evaluations. In that version, Betty's rage had become its own force, separate from whatever legitimate grievances she may have held. Her behaviour had escalated beyond anything that could be explained by grief or frustration. She had moved past anger and into something that the people around her recognised as dangerous. Dan and Linda Kolkina were married on April 22, 1989, roughly 3 months after the divorce was finalised. They held the ceremony in their home on Cypress Avenue. Betty was not invited, but she knew about it. She knew about everything. Friends later said she monitored Dan and Linda's life with an intensity that bordered on surveillance. She kept track of where they went, what they did, who they saw. She talked about them constantly. She could not stop. The months between the wedding and the murders were marked by a kind of slow, tightening pressure. Betty's financial situation had worsened. The divorce settlement gave her roughly $16,000 a month in combined alimony and child support, a sum that most people would consider generous. But Betty had been accustomed to spending far more than that during the marriage, and she had legal bills of her own. She felt the settlement was a fraction of what she deserved. She appealed. The appeal was denied. She continued to leave messages on Dan and Linda's answering machine. Some of those messages, which were played during the trials, contained language so raw and graphic that they startled even the prosecutors who presented them. On the evening of November 4th, 1989, Betty left her home and drove to the house on Cypress Avenue. She had a key that one of the children had given her. She also had a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver that she had purchased weeks earlier. She later said she brought the gun to force Dan to talk to her. She later said she did not go there intending to kill anyone. She later said many things, and none of them changed what happened next. Sometime in the early morning hours of November 5th, Betty entered the house through a side door. She walked upstairs to the master bedroom. Dan and Linda were asleep. What happened in that room lasted only seconds. Betty fired 5 rounds. 2 struck Dan, 1 struck Linda. The other 2 hit the walls and nightstand. Dan was hit in the chest and back. He died almost instantly. Linda was hit in the chest and head. She also died. During the second trial, Betty testified that she was startled when Linda screamed for someone to call the police and that she fired the gun reflexively. Prosecutors argued otherwise. They said Betty had planned the killings, driven to the house with a loaded weapon, and executed 2 people in their sleep. After the shooting, Betty unplugged the bedside phone and left the house. She drove to a payphone and called her friend. She told her what she had done. Then she called her eldest daughter, Kim, and told her the same thing. She turned herself into authorities later that morning. The first trial began in October of 1990. It ended in a hung jury. The vote was reportedly 10-2 in favour of conviction, with 2 jurors holding out for a lesser charge. The foreman was later reported as saying he wondered why it had taken her so long. That remark captured something about the public reaction to the case that persisted for years afterward. There were people, many of them women, who saw Betty Broderick as a sympathetic figure. They saw a wife who had been cheated on, lied to, and outmanoeuvred by a man who used the legal system as a weapon. They saw her as someone who had been pushed to a breaking point. This view did not excuse what she had done, but it explained it in a way that resonated with a particular kind of anger. The second trial began in December of 1991. This time, prosecutor Kerry Wells portrayed Betty as cold, calculating, and driven by a desire for revenge that had nothing to do with self-defense or temporary insanity. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz, testifying for the prosecution, diagnosed Betty with histrionic and narcissistic personality disorders. He described her as someone whose sense of entitlement was so extreme that she could not tolerate the idea of Dan living a life without her. The defence, led by attorney Jack Early, argued that Betty had been psychologically battered during the marriage and that years of abuse had driven her to the point of no return. The jury sided with the prosecution. On December 11, 1991, Betty Broderick was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. She showed no visible reaction when the verdict was read. Over the next 3 decades, Betty Broderick became one of the most recognisable figures in American true crime. Her case was the subject of 2 CBS television movies in 1992, starring Meredith Baxter. A best-selling book by Bella Stumbo, published in 1993, offered a detailed account of the marriage and its aftermath. In 2020, the USA Network produced an 8-episode limited series titled Dirty John, The Betty Broderick Story, which brought the case to a new generation. Throughout all of it, Betty maintained that she had not premeditated the killings. She never expressed what the parole board considered adequate remorse. She was denied parole for the first time in January of 2010. The board told her that her heart was still bitter. She was denied again in January of 2017. At that hearing, her own son, Daniel Broderick IV, spoke against her release, calling her dangerous. Another son, Rhett, spoke in her favour. The family was split. It had been split since the night of the murders, and it stayed that way. By her late 70s, Betty's health had deteriorated. In April of 2026, she was transferred from the California Institution for Women in Chino to a specialized medical facility in San Bernardino County. She had suffered a fall that resulted in broken ribs and subsequent infections. According to her children, she was surrounded by family when she died on the morning of May 8, 2026. She was 78 years old. The California Department of Corrections listed her initial cause of death as natural. She had been in custody for 36 years and 6 months. Dan and Linda Broderick are buried together at Greenwood Memorial Park in San Diego. Their graves sit side by side as they were in the bed the night Betty came through the door. The 4 Broderick children, now adults, have spoken publicly about the case at various times over the years, and their accounts vary depending on which parent they chose to stand beside. Some of them forgave Betty, some of them did not. Some of them shifted positions more than once. The damage done on that November morning reached further than the 2 people who died. It reached into a family and never fully let go. The Betty Broderick case became a reference point in the national conversation about divorce, custody, and what happens when one partner holds more legal power than the other. It also became a reference point for something else, the specific danger that comes not during a marriage, but after one. The restraining orders were in place, the divorce was final, the new life had begun, and none of it was enough to stop what was coming. The separation was complete on paper. The separation was not complete in Betty Broderick's mind, and on November 5, 1989, she closed the distance between those 2 things with a .38 caliber revolver and a key her daughter had given her. Before we move on, If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to a small apartment in Midvale, Utah, 3 days after Thanksgiving in 2018. A young woman had been dating her boyfriend for 6 months. His ex-wife had been watching for longer than that. Case 2. Chelsea Watrous Cook. The station at Midvale was one of those complexes, a cluster of residential buildings near the corner of Center Street and 7800 South. In late November of 2018, a man named Travis Cook lived there with his 3-year-old twin daughters. He had been divorced since January of that year. He had been dating a woman named Lisa Villate Williams for about 6 months. And on the evening of November 25th, the Sunday after Thanksgiving, Lisa was inside the apartment with Travis and the twins, making homemade Christmas ornaments and decorating a tree. Lisa Williams was 26 years old. She had grown up in Arizona, in a town called Centennial Park near the Utah border, and had moved to the Salt Lake City area in 2015. She worked as a bank teller. Her family described her as someone who loved the small things in life. She liked caring for plants, especially the ones that looked like they were beyond saving. She would buy the saddest looking plant at the store and bring it home as a project. She liked planning small outings for the people she cared about. Her sister Becca later said that Lisa and Travis had what she called Parisian-themed dates. Lisa had a gift for making ordinary days feel like something worth remembering. She had met Travis at the bank where she worked. He was a co-worker. They started dating sometime in the spring of 2018, and by fall, Lisa had become close with his twin daughters. She was careful about it. She understood the situation. Travis had been through a difficult divorce, and the children were young enough that any new person in their lives had to be introduced gently. Lisa seemed to take that responsibility seriously. The family that Thanksgiving had been together in Arizona, and Lisa had left the gathering early to get back to Utah. She wanted to spend the holiday weekend with Travis and the girls. She had asked her family for suggestions on things she could make with the twins. Christmas ornaments was the answer. She brought supplies back with her. Travis Cook and Chelsea Watrous Cook had married sometime before the twins were born. Their divorce was finalised in January of 2018, roughly 11 months before the shooting. The details of the marriage and what led to its end are not fully documented in public records, but what is known is that the split was not clean. Custody of the twins was shared, and the exchanges between Travis and Chelsea were described in court documents and police reports as difficult. There was friction, there were arguments, and as the months passed and Travis began seeing Lisa, that friction took on a sharper edge. Chelsea Watrous Cook was 32 years old. She lived in Herriman, a suburb about 15 miles southwest of Midvale. She was a health and yoga teacher at Skyridge High School in Lehi, part of the Alpine School District that covers a large portion of northern Utah County. Students and colleagues knew her as an energetic and well-liked teacher. She had a good reputation at the school. She was popular with students. She brought her daughters into the classroom sometimes. From the outside, she appeared to be managing the transition from married life to single motherhood in the way that many people do, one day at a time. But Lisa Williams' family later told investigators that the reality behind that appearance was different. They said Chelsea had been harassing Lisa for months. The harassment took several forms. Chelsea showed up at the bank where Lisa worked. She made phone calls. She sent messages on Instagram. She wrote Lisa a threatening letter. The campaign was persistent enough that Lisa's mother, Tawny Williams, later said she worried about her daughter's safety every single day. Lisa was aware of it. She talked about it with her family. But she was reluctant to go to the police. She worried that involving law enforcement would make things harder for the twins. She did not want the children caught in the middle of something that might escalate if authorities stepped in. On October 16, 2018, roughly 5 weeks before the shooting, an incident occurred that resulted in Chelsea being arrested on a misdemeanor domestic violence charge. The details of that incident were contained in a police report obtained later through a public records request. According to that report, Travis had arrived to pick up the twins for a custody exchange. During an unrelated argument, Chelsea began making what the report described as disparaging comments about Lisa Williams. When Travis prompted one of the children to say she was excited about seeing Lisa, Chelsea became angry. She grabbed Travis by the hair and sent him tumbling down the stairs. Lisa was not present at the time. Chelsea was charged with domestic violence committed in the presence of children, along with 2 other misdemeanor counts. Under Utah law, she was required to report the arrest to her school district within 48 hours. She did not. The Alpine School District later confirmed that they were never notified. A spokesperson said that if they had known, they would have taken steps to ensure everyone involved was safe. The state's fingerprint notification system, which is supposed to flag teacher arrests to school districts, did not process Chelsea's paperwork until after the shooting. Had the citation been filed electronically by Herriman Police, the district would have been alerted weeks earlier. That notification failure became a secondary point of scrutiny in the aftermath of what happened next. Chelsea appeared in Herriman Justice Court on November 13th for an arraignment on the domestic violence charges. She pleaded not guilty to all 3 counts. 12 days later, on the evening of November 25th, she drove to Travis Cook's apartment in Midvale. The sequence of events that unfolded at the apartment was reconstructed from 911 call recordings, police interviews, surveillance footage from the apartment complex, and charging documents filed in Salt Lake County. According to those records, Chelsea sent Travis a message saying she would be coming by to drop off cold medicine for one of the twins, who was feeling sick. Travis went down to the parking lot to meet her. While he was outside, Chelsea entered the apartment. Surveillance footage from the building's hallway showed Chelsea in the corridor, looking at her phone. Once Travis was out of sight, she slipped inside the apartment without knocking. When Travis returned and found her inside, he told her to leave. She refused. He told her again. She still refused. She walked into the bathroom and locked the door. Travis picked up his phone and called 911. The bathroom door was closed for roughly 15 seconds. Then Chelsea came out. She walked toward her coat, which was lying near the entryway. Travis was behind her, still on the phone with the dispatcher. Chelsea reached into the coat and pulled out a handgun. She turned and fired 3 to 5 rounds at Lisa Williams, who was standing near the Christmas tree. Lisa was struck in the chest, the hip, and the leg. She fell backward onto the couch. The twins were in the living room. They had been standing next to her moments before. Travis dropped the phone and rushed toward Chelsea. He grabbed the gun from her hands and tried to help Lisa. He called 911 again. While he was on the phone, Chelsea got up from where she had been sitting with the children and walked back toward her coat. Travis did not know if she had a second weapon. He left Lisa on the couch, crossed the room, and pinned Chelsea against the wall. He held her there until officers arrived. Lisa Velate Williams was transported to a local hospital. She died from her injuries later that evening. She was 26 years old. When paramedics and police entered the apartment, the scene was largely as Travis had described it on the 911 calls. Lisa was on the couch. The Christmas ornaments and decorations were scattered across the living room. The twins, both 3 years old, had been present for the entire event. They had watched a woman walk out of a bathroom, pull a gun from a coat, and shoot the person who had been making ornaments with them. They had watched their father wrestle the gun away. They had watched their mother sit back down beside them, as if the evening might continue. Chelsea Watrous Cook was arrested and booked into the Salt Lake County Jail on suspicion of aggravated murder. She was held without bail. The charges filed against her included aggravated murder, a first-degree felony, aggravated burglary, also a first-degree felony, 3 counts of felony discharge of a firearm at varying degrees, and 2 counts of committing a violent offence in the presence of a child, both Class B misdemeanors. The aggravated murder charge, under Utah law, carried the possibility of the death penalty. In the days following the arrest, Lisa's family began speaking publicly. Her mother, Tawny, posted on social media that her daughter had been killed while decorating a Christmas tree with homemade ornaments she was making with the children. She described Lisa as kind, sweet, generous, and loving, someone who brought joy and excitement to every part of life. She asked people to remember Lisa for how she lived, not for how she died. Lisa's sister Becca wrote that Lisa loved all the small things and was enamored with making every little detail special and beautiful. She said Lisa had left the family's Thanksgiving gathering in Arizona early because she was excited to get back to Utah and spend the weekend with the twins. She had spoken to Lisa about an hour before the shooting and said her sister was looking forward to giving those kids something happy. The Alpine School District confirmed Chelsea's employment status and said she had been placed on administrative leave. Principal Joel Perkins of Skyridge High School sent an email to parents the day after the arrest, letting them know what had happened. Counselors were brought in for students. Chelsea had been scheduled to teach yoga the following term. That assignment was cancelled. The case moved slowly through the court system. Chelsea was initially represented by a defence attorney, and early proceedings focused on whether the death penalty would be sought. In February of 2020, more than a year after the shooting, a plea agreement was reached. Chelsea pleaded guilty to aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, 1 count of first-degree felony discharge of a firearm, 1 count of second-degree felony discharge, 1 count of third-degree felony discharge, and 2 counts of the misdemeanor child violence charges. In exchange for the guilty pleas, prosecutors took the death penalty off the table. At her sentencing hearing in June of 2020, held in the 3rd District Court in West Jordan, multiple members of Lisa's family delivered statements. Her brother Hiram addressed Chelsea directly. He told her that because of what she did, he no longer gets to hear Lisa's contagious laughter bouncing around the house. He said that when she took Lisa's life, she took a light from the world. Other family members spoke about the things they would never get to do with Lisa, the trip to France they had been planning, watching her start her own family, sitting down to talk with her over a cup of coffee. Chelsea also addressed the court. She told the judge that at the time of the shooting, she was only thinking of herself and the extreme emotional pain she was experiencing. She said she was sorry the children had to see her shoot and kill Lisa. She said that all Lisa ever did was love them. Her defense attorney told the court that Chelsea had purchased the gun with the intention of killing herself, not Lisa, and that she had stopped taking her psychiatric medication in the period before the shooting. The prosecution countered that Chelsea's actions were not impulsive. Deputy Salt Lake County Attorney Colleen McGee told the court that Chelsea had been dealing with depression for a long time and had previously practiced driving to the apartment. She had rehearsed the route. She had gone through the motions of arriving at the building before the night she actually carried out the killing. Judge Royal Hanson handed down the sentence. For the aggravated murder charge, Chelsea received 25 years to life. For the aggravated burglary, she received 6 years to life. For the felony discharge of a firearm, she received 3 to 5 years. The judge ordered all 3 sentences to be served consecutively, meaning Chelsea would need to serve a minimum of 34 years before she would be eligible for parole. She was given credit for time already served in the Salt Lake County Jail on the 2 misdemeanor counts. Before announcing the sentence, Hanson told Chelsea that he was shocked by the amount of time she had spent talking about herself in the documents submitted ahead of the hearing. The remark was pointed. It suggested that even in the context of expressing remorse, Chelsea's focus had remained inward, on her own suffering, her own pain, her own emotional state. The judge did not elaborate, but the implication was clear. At the request of the defence, Hanson dismissed 2 of the 3 felony discharge counts, on the grounds that the discharge was already accounted for in the murder charge itself. But he kept the 3rd count, noting that one of the bullets had missed Lisa entirely and struck a wall, meaning it had the potential to have harmed someone else in the apartment. Someone else, in this context, meant one of the 3-year-old twins. Travis Cook spoke after the sentencing. He said he planned to ask Utah legislators to pass a law in Lisa's name that would prevent courts from dismissing charges in cases where the discharge was part of a murder. He wanted every charge to carry its full weight. He did not want any portion of what Chelsea had done to be folded into something else and quietly set aside. Lisa Velate Williams' funeral was held in Arizona, in the community where she had grown up. Her family buried her there, close to the people and the place she had come from. She had moved to Utah 3 years earlier to start something new. She had found a job, a partner, and 2 small children who liked making ornaments with her on the Sunday after Thanksgiving. None of those things protected her. The restraining mechanisms that might have intervened, the domestic violence arrest that should have flagged Chelsea to her employer, the pattern of harassment that Lisa chose not to report out of concern for the children, all of it fell short. And in the 60 seconds between the bathroom door opening and the last shot being fired, every failure converged in a single room. Chelsea Watrous Cook remains incarcerated at the Utah State Prison in Draper. Under the terms of her sentence, she will not be eligible for parole until at least 2052. She will be 66 years old. Her twin daughters, who were 3 at the time of the shooting, will be in their mid-30s. The ornaments Lisa was helping them make that evening were never finished. A journal entry Lisa had written before her death was read aloud during the sentencing hearing. It was addressed to Chelsea, though Lisa had never sent it. In the entry, Lisa wrote that she would not allow Chelsea to tear her down. She wrote that she hoped they could move past the conflict between them. She wrote that she had come to love Chelsea's children and wanted nothing but good things for them. The letter ended with a simple appeal for peace. It was the kind of letter written by someone who still believed the situation could be resolved with words. That belief, by the time it was read in a courtroom, had already been proven wrong. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From Utah, the next case moves east to the suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, where a university professor stepped outside in his pajamas on a dark October morning to pick up the newspaper. His ex-wife was already in the driveway waiting behind his van. She had flown in from Texas the night before, wearing a blonde wig and carrying her sister's driver's license. Case 3. Piper Roundtree. Tuckahoe Village is one of those neighborhoods, a residential pocket of single-family homes on curving streets, where the houses sit far enough apart that most people know their neighbors, but not their schedules. The house at 1515 Hearthglow Lane belonged to a man named Frederick Mark Jablin, a 52-year-old communications professor at the University of Richmond's Jepson School of Leadership Studies. He had lived there with his 3 children since the divorce. The oldest was 15, the youngest was 8. On the morning of Saturday, October 30th, 2004, the day before Halloween, all 3 of them were asleep upstairs when their father walked outside in his pajamas and slippers to get the morning newspaper from the end of the driveway. It was still dark. The sun would not come up for another hour. The neighborhood was quiet. A few of the homes nearby had jack-o'-lanterns on the porches and fake cobwebs strung across the railings. Jablin reached the driveway and moved past his parked van. Someone was standing behind it. Neighbors reported hearing 3 sharp sounds around 6:40 in the morning. One woman told investigators she hoped the noise was a malfunctioning transformer. Her husband, lying beside her, knew it was not. The shots were too precise, too evenly spaced. 3 bangs and then silence. Nobody called the police immediately. The sounds folded into the early morning stillness, and most people went back to sleep. It was not until later that morning, when a passerby noticed Jablin lying face down on the pavement near the end of his driveway, that anyone realized what had happened. Frederick Jablin had been shot 3 times. He was pronounced dead at the scene. His children, still inside the house, learned what had happened when police arrived. The 15-year-old daughter found out first, then the younger 2. Their father had walked outside to do something he did every morning, and he had not come back. Henrico County Police launched the investigation immediately. The crime scene was contained. There was no sign of forced entry into the house. Nothing inside had been disturbed. The killing appeared targeted and efficient. Jablin had been shot at close range with a .38 caliber revolver, 3 rounds. No witnesses who saw the shooter. No security cameras on the street. The first question detectives asked was the question they always ask. Who would want this man dead? The answer came quickly. Almost everyone who knew Jablin pointed investigators toward the same person, his ex-wife, a woman named Piper Ann Roundtree. Piper Roundtree was born in 1960, the youngest of 5 children on a small farm in South Texas. She was bright and ambitious. She left home at 18 to attend the University of Texas, and by her mid-20s, she had earned a law degree and begun working as a prosecutor. She was described by people who knew her in those years as smart, attractive, and confident, someone who expected things to go her way and who became visibly frustrated when they did not. She met Frederick Jablin in the late 1980s. He was an academic, quiet and bookish, deeply invested in his work as a communications scholar. They married and had 3 children together. For a time, the family lived in Texas while Piper practiced law and Fred pursued his academic career. In 1993, Piper opened her own private legal practice, but she closed it after only a year when Fred accepted a faculty position at the University of Richmond. The family moved to Virginia. The relocation was the beginning of the end of the marriage, though it took years for the split to become official. Piper was unable to pass the Virginia bar exam, which meant she could not practice law in the state. Without a legal career, she struggled to find her footing professionally. The move had been made for Fred's career, and Piper felt she had given up her own in the process. That resentment grew. The couple argued. The arguments became sharper. By the early 2000s, the marriage was over. The divorce was finalized in 2002. The proceedings were hostile. Fred was awarded primary custody of the 3 children, a ruling that Piper contested fiercely and repeatedly. She was also ordered to pay child support. The terms of the settlement left her feeling stripped of everything that mattered to her. She moved back to Texas, settling in Houston to be near her older sister Tina. The plan was to restart her legal career in a state where she still held a license. She tried. She opened a small practice with her sister's help. It did not take off. She fell behind on her child support payments. Within 2 years of the divorce, she owed Fred Jablin close to $10,000. Despite living more than 1,300 miles from her children, Piper maintained regular contact. She called them every night. She helped them with homework over the phone. She saw them during summers and holidays. She later described herself as a devoted mother who simply happened to live in a different state. That devotion was real, at least in part, but so was the anger. The anger at Fred for the custody ruling, the anger at the legal system for allowing it, the anger at the distance that had opened between her and the children she believed she had a right to raise. In the fall of 2004, that anger found a plan. The timeline of what Piper did in the weeks before the murder was assembled by investigators through credit card records, surveillance footage, cell phone data, and witness statements. The picture that emerged was methodical and deliberate. In mid-October, Piper visited a sporting goods store and purchased a gun lock. She visited a shooting range and practiced with a .38 caliber revolver. She ordered 2 wigs online using her boyfriend's credit card, 1 blonde and 1 red. She booked a round-trip airline ticket from Houston to Richmond under her sister Tina's name, also using her boyfriend's credit card. On October 28th, 2 days before the murder, Piper flew from Houston to Richmond. She was wearing the blonde wig and traveling under Tina's identification. At the airport, a ticket counter agent remembered her because she checked a firearm in her luggage, a .38 caliber revolver secured with a brand new gun lock. The agent remembered the wig too. She thought the woman looked uncomfortable, as if she did not want to be recognized. Piper rented a car and checked into a motel near Richmond. She paid with her boyfriend's credit card. A motel clerk noticed the wig and noted that the woman avoided eye contact. Cell phone tower records placed Piper's phone in the Richmond area on the nights of October 28th and 29th, contradicting her later claim that she had remained in Texas during that period. She had brought the phone with her, either out of habit or carelessness, and every time it pinged a tower, it drew a line from Houston to Virginia. On the morning of October 30th, Piper drove the rental car to Tuckahoe Village. She parked near Hearthglow Lane and made her way to Jablin's driveway on foot. She positioned herself behind his van and waited. When Fred came outside to get the newspaper, she stepped out. According to testimony presented at trial, Fred saw someone moving and asked who was there. Piper came around the side of the van. What she said next was described by a witness who later spoke to investigators. She said 4 words. "You know who it is, Fred?" Then she fired 3 times. After the shooting, Piper returned to the rental car and drove back toward the airport. She flew home to Houston, arriving later that day. She disposed of the blonde wig. She changed clothes. She resumed her normal routine as if nothing had happened. In her mind, the murder was clean. She had used a false identity. She had travelled under her sister's name. She had worn a disguise. She believed she had left nothing behind. She was wrong. Detectives in Henrico County moved quickly. Within days, they had identified Piper as the primary suspect. The circumstantial trail she left was extensive. The credit card charges, the cell phone records, the airline ticket booked under Tina's name, the motel clerk who remembered the blonde wig, the ticket agent who remembered the checked firearm, the gun lock purchased at the sporting goods store, the practice sessions at the shooting range. Each piece by itself was suggestive. Together, they formed a chain that linked Piper Roundtree to Richmond on the morning of the killing. with a weapon in her possession and a documented history of hostility toward the victim. On November 8, 2004, 9 days after the murder, Piper flew back to Virginia. She was there for a custody hearing, a previously scheduled court date related to the ongoing disputes over the children. When she arrived at the courthouse, the hearing proceeded. Given that Fred was dead, the judge awarded custody of the 3 children to Fred's brother, Michael Jablin. Moments after Piper left the courthouse, Richmond police pulled her car over and arrested her on a charge of first-degree murder. The arrest was national news. A former prosecutor, a mother of 3, an attorney who had once put criminals behind bars, now charged with ambushing and killing her ex-husband in his own driveway while their children slept upstairs. The details about the wig, the fake identity, the checked firearm, and the 1,300-mile flight gave her story a quality that made it feel scripted. It did not seem real, but the evidence said otherwise. Piper's trial began on February 22, 2005, in Henrico County Circuit Court. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. There were no eyewitnesses to the shooting itself, no DNA evidence recovered from the scene that matched Piper, no fingerprints on the shell casings. But the documentary trail was overwhelming. Prosecutors walked the jury through every credit card transaction, every cell phone ping, every motel receipt, every airline record. They showed the jury that Piper had purchased the wigs. They showed the jury that she had practiced at the range. They showed the jury that she had flown to Richmond under her sister's name and checked a revolver in her luggage. They showed the jury that she was in the area on the night before the killing and gone by the afternoon of the killing, and they offered a motive that was not complicated: a bitter divorce, a custody ruling that took her children away, a financial obligation she could not meet, a life that had not turned out the way she planned, and a man she blamed for all of it. The defense took a different approach. Piper's attorney, Murray Janus, argued that the prosecution's evidence was circumstantial and that someone else might have committed the murder. Specifically, the defense pointed toward Piper's sister Tina. The argument was that Tina, not Piper, had travelled to Virginia, and that the blonde wig the witnesses remembered was consistent with Tina's natural hair colour, not Piper's. The defense suggested that Tina had her own reasons for wanting Fred dead, though those reasons were never clearly articulated. Janus later described the strategy to reporters as a calculated gamble. He told the Houston Chronicle that the circumstantial evidence against Piper was overwhelming and that suggesting an alternative suspect was their best option. Piper took the stand in her own defense. As a former attorney, she was comfortable in a courtroom and projected confidence during her testimony. She denied travelling to Virginia. She denied purchasing the wigs for disguise purposes. She denied killing Fred Jablin. She offered explanations for the credit card charges and cell phone records that prosecutors had presented, but those explanations were thin and often contradicted by the physical evidence. The jury deliberated and returned a guilty verdict. Piper Roundtree was convicted of first-degree murder. On May 6, 2005, she was sentenced to life in prison, plus 3 additional years for the use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. Tina Roundtree was never charged with any crime. She cooperated with investigators and was not considered a suspect by law enforcement. The defense's strategy of pointing toward her had been exactly what Janus described: a gamble, one that did not pay off. Piper appealed the conviction. Her attorneys argued that the trial had been prejudiced and that the evidence was insufficient to support a first-degree murder conviction. In July of 2007, the Virginia Court of Appeals upheld the conviction. Further appeals followed. In 2008, the United States Supreme Court declined to hear the case, effectively exhausting Piper's federal options. Under Virginia law, inmates sentenced to life who reach the age of 60 and have served at least 10 years become eligible for geriatric parole consideration. Piper turned 60 in 2020. Her first geriatric parole application was denied in March of that year. A second application was denied in April of 2023. The Virginia Parole Board concluded that she should serve more time, that her release would diminish the seriousness of the crime, and that she required further participation in institutional programs before she could be considered for release. Fred Jablin's 3 children grew up without either parent. Their father was dead, their mother was in prison. Custody passed to Fred's brother Michael, who raised them in a household shaped by the absence of both of the people who were supposed to be there. The children did not speak publicly about the case during the trial, though the eldest daughter's presence in the courtroom was noted by reporters who covered the proceedings. She was 18 by the time the verdict came in. She had been 15 when she woke up on that Saturday morning and learned that her father had been shot in the driveway. What makes the Piper Roundtree case distinct among custody-related killings is the distance she travelled to carry it out. 1,300 miles, a round-trip flight booked under a false name, a disguise assembled over the course of 2 weeks, a practice session at a firing range. The planning was extensive, patient, and focused. This was not a crime committed in the heat of an argument or in the chaos of a custody exchange. This was a crime committed by someone who had decided, weeks in advance, that she was going to fly across the country, disguise herself as her sister, wait in a dark driveway, and shoot the father of her children before he reached the end of his front walk. She brought the murder weapon through airport security. She checked it as luggage. She flew home the same day with the confidence that no one would connect her to what had happened. And for 9 days, she was right. She attended the custody hearing. She sat in the courtroom. She listened as a judge decided what would happen to her children now that their father was gone. She did all of this knowing what she had done, carrying the fact of it with her like a second passport, something that belonged to her and no one else. The distance between Houston and Richmond is roughly 1,300 miles by air. Piper Roundtree covered that distance twice in 3 days. The first time, to kill Fred Jablin. The second time, to sit in a courtroom and claim his children. The arrest happened in the space between those 2 trips, in a parking lot outside the courthouse, where the life she thought she could reassemble after the murder fell apart in the time it took an officer to walk to her car window. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case stays with ex-wives and ex-husbands, but the geography shifts to Florida, where a 51-year-old woman drove across the state on a single Wednesday afternoon in December 2025, killing both of her former husbands in separate homes before going home and reaching for the bleach. Case 4. Susan Avalon Chatham. Light Run is one of those streets, a quiet residential loop where the houses sit close together and the lawns are kept green year-round by sprinkler systems that run on timers. On the afternoon of Wednesday, December 17, 2025, a 54-year-old man was inside his home on Chatham Light Run when someone knocked on his front door. His 15-year-old daughter was also home. School had let out for the day. The neighbourhood was busy with the usual afternoon activity, kids getting off buses, cars pulling into driveways, garage doors going up and down. The man opened his door. Standing on the other side was a woman in a grey sweatshirt and a surgical mask, holding a bag of food from Panera Bread. As soon as the door was open, the woman raised a handgun and fired. The man was struck twice. He fell backward into the house. The woman turned, walked to a silver Honda Odyssey parked nearby, and drove away. The man's daughter did not see the shooting. She was in another part of the house. But she heard 3 gunshots, and when she looked outside, she saw the Odyssey pulling away from the curb. She was 15 years old, and her father had just been shot in the entryway of their home. She was able to give deputies a description of the vehicle and the clothing the shooter was wearing. Manatee County Sheriff's deputies arrived within minutes. Paramedics transported the man to a local hospital. Before he lost consciousness, the man was able to answer one question. Deputies asked him who could have done this. He told them it was possibly his ex-wife, a woman named Susan Avalon. He said they had been divorced for about 11 years. He said there were ongoing disputes over child support. He said she owed him roughly $4,000. Then he was taken into surgery. He died from his injuries later that evening. The investigation moved fast. Detectives pulled surveillance footage from a Panera Bread restaurant located about 1.5 miles from the victim's home. The footage showed a woman matching the description given by the daughter, walking into the restaurant, going to the pickup shelf where mobile and delivery orders are left for customers, taking a bag of food that did not belong to her, and walking out without paying. She had not ordered anything. She had not placed a delivery request. She had simply grabbed someone else's food off the shelf and carried it to the victim's front door as a prop. A way to make the man open the door without suspicion. It looked like a DoorDash delivery. It was a murder. Manatee County Sheriff Rick Wells described the attack during a press conference the following day. He called it brazen. He said the shooting happened at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Wednesday in a neighbourhood full of activity. Kids were coming home from school, people were walking dogs, cars were moving through the streets. The shooter did not seem to care about any of it. While Manatee County detectives were working the Bradenton case, they began pulling together background information on Susan Avalon. They learned she was 51 years old and lived in Citrus County, roughly 100 miles north of Bradenton. They also learned something that expanded the scope of the investigation in a direction nobody anticipated. Susan Avalon had been married more than once. She had a second ex-husband, and that second ex-husband lived in Tampa. Detectives contacted the Tampa Police Department and asked them to conduct a welfare check at a residence on East Frierson Avenue on the east side of the city. Officers went to the home that evening. When they arrived, nobody answered the door. They noticed damage near the rear entrance that appeared consistent with forced entry. Officers made the decision to go inside. They found an adult male dead from multiple gunshot wounds. He had been killed earlier that day. The timeline investigators pieced together over the following hours suggested that Avalon had driven south from Citrus County that morning, gone to the Tampa residence first, forced her way in through the back door, and shot her second ex-husband. She then drove roughly 60 miles south to Bradenton, stopped at the Panera Bread to pick up the food prop, and carried out the second shooting. After killing both men in separate cities in separate counties within the span of a few hours, she drove home to Citrus County. Detectives tracked her movements using license plate readers and surveillance footage from toll plazas and highways. Her Honda Odyssey was captured crossing the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, the long span that connects Pinellas County to Manatee County across Tampa Bay, on her way south to Bradenton. The same vehicle was later captured heading north again towards Citrus County. The trail of footage placed her in Tampa, then in Bradenton, then heading home. 2 stops, 2 ex-husbands, 1 afternoon. When Manatee County detectives arrived at Avalon's home in Citrus County that evening, they saw her walking out of her house carrying bleach and clean rags. She was heading toward her Odyssey. She had not called anyone about what she had done. She had not told her live-in boyfriend, who was inside the house. She had come home, taken a shower, and was now attempting to wipe down the inside of her vehicle. Detectives approached her and told her they needed to speak with her about her ex-husband. Her response would become the single most quoted detail of the case. She looked at the detectives and asked a one-word question. Which one? That question changed the shape of the investigation on the spot. The Manatee County detectives had come to ask about the Bradenton victim. They did not yet have confirmation of what had happened in Tampa. When Avalon asked which ex-husband they were referring to, the detectives realized she assumed they were from a different jurisdiction, asking about a different killing. She thought they were from Tampa. She did not know they were from Manatee County. Her confusion told them everything. She had killed both men and was now trying to figure out which murder had caught up to her first. Detectives interviewed Avalon's live-in boyfriend inside the house. He told them that Susan had recently found out where the Bradenton victim was living. She had tracked down his address after not knowing it for some time. The boyfriend also told detectives something else. The day before the shootings, Susan had said something to him that was out of character. She told him that in case something happened to her, she loved him and wanted him to know that. He described the comment as strange, the kind of thing she would not normally say. He did not know what she meant by it at the time. By the time detectives were standing in his living room, the meaning was clear. Susan Erica Avalon was arrested that night and booked on a charge of second-degree murder in connection with the Bradenton killing. The Manatee County Sheriff's Office announced that prosecutors intended to seek a first-degree murder charge and the death penalty. The Tampa Police Department opened a parallel homicide investigation for the killing on East Frierson Avenue. As of the initial court proceedings, Tampa authorities were still working with the state attorney's office to determine the formal charges in that case. Avalon made her first court appearance on December 23, 2025. Circuit Court Judge Frederick Mercurio ordered her held without release, pending a pre-trial detention hearing scheduled for early January. During the appearance, Avalon asked if her attorney was present, saying she had spoken with 2 lawyers who told her they would attend. The judge told her a public defender would be appointed if she qualified. The hearing was brief. She was returned to custody. Sheriff Wells held a press conference on December 18th, in which he laid out the broad strokes of the investigation. He said the case involved approximately 5 children between the 2 marriages. He said the motive and full mindset of the suspect were still being determined. He noted that Avalon had a prior history of arrests related to child abuse and custody disputes dating back to 2004, including a case in Virginia. Other child abuse cases in Tampa and Pasco County had been filed and later dropped. Investigators said those earlier cases were tied to custody disputes with her ex-husbands. The details about those prior cases remain limited in public records. What is known is that Avalon had unresolved grievances with both men that stretched back years, possibly decades. The Bradenton victim had been her first husband. They were married for 11 years before the divorce. The Tampa victim was her second husband. The specifics of their marriage and separation are less documented, but the outcome was the same. Both marriages ended, both men moved on, and on a Wednesday in December, both men were killed in their own homes by the same woman within hours of each other. The stolen Panera bread was a detail that stuck with people who followed the case. It was such a mundane object, a bag of food grabbed off a shelf, turned into a tool of deception. The surgical mask was another detail that lingered. In the years since the pandemic, a person wearing a mask in public drew almost no attention. It was the kind of thing people barely noticed anymore. Avalon used that invisibility. She used a mask to conceal her face and a bag of food to explain her presence at the front door. Together, those 2 items gave her the few seconds she needed. The time it took the man to process what he was looking at. A delivery, a woman in a mask, a bag from Panera. By the time his brain caught up to what was actually happening, she had already fired. The 15-year-old daughter who was home during the Bradenton shooting was described by Sheriff Wells as deeply traumatized. He asked the public to understand the impact of what she had experienced. She had heard the gunshots. She had seen the vehicle drive away. She had come to find her father on the floor of his own home. She had to give a statement to deputies while paramedics worked on him, and then she had to absorb the news, sometime later that evening, that he did not survive. Between the 2 ex-husbands, there were roughly 5 children affected. Some of those children were minors, some were adults. The exact breakdown of which children belonged to which marriage was not specified in public reporting, and Manatee County authorities were careful to protect the identities of the minors involved. What was made clear is that the scope of damage extended well beyond the 2 victims. 2 households were destroyed. Children in both families lost their fathers on the same day, killed by the same person, a woman who had once been married to each of them. Neighbours in the Heritage Harbour community remembered the Bradenton victim as a kind and gentle man. One neighbour named Ronald Andriano told reporters that he had met the man about a year and a half earlier. He said the man walked every morning from his house to the neighbourhood park, and that whenever he passed by, they would say hello and talk for a few minutes. Andriano described him as a nice man with a nice family, daughters, a son, 2 dogs. He said it was the kind of household that made the neighbourhood feel like a neighbourhood. The murder weapon was not recovered during the initial search of Avalon's home and vehicle. Detectives continued going through the Odyssey for evidence, and the search for the gun remained ongoing through the end of December. Avalon did not provide a statement to investigators. She did not cooperate beyond the initial exchange in which she asked which ex-husband the detectives were there about. After that, she went silent. The case drew national attention, in part because of the double killing, and in part because of the method. The Panera bread prop was unusual. It suggested a level of forethought that went beyond impulse. Avalon had driven to a restaurant, walked inside, taken food from the shelf, and used it as a disguise for what came next. She had worn a mask. She had planned the route from Tampa to Bradenton. She had cleaned up afterward. She had brought bleach to the car. Each step implied preparation. Each step suggested that the killings were not spontaneous acts of rage, but planned executions carried out on a schedule. The Sunshine Skyway Bridge, which Avalon crossed on her way from Tampa to Bradenton, is one of the most recognizable structures in Florida. It rises 200 feet above Tampa Bay, a cable-stayed span with bright yellow cables that can be seen for miles. Driving across it takes roughly 10 minutes. During those 10 minutes, Susan Avalon was between killings. She had already shot one ex-husband in Tampa. She was on her way to shoot another in Bradenton. The bridge sat between the two acts, a stretch of open water and open sky, separating the first murder from the second. What she was thinking during that crossing is something only she knows, and she has not shared it. But the physical distance between the two homes was significant. Tampa to Bradenton is roughly 60 miles by highway. Avalon covered that distance in the middle of the day, in traffic, on roads that pass through some of the most populated areas of Florida's Gulf Coast. She was not hiding. She was driving a recognizable vehicle with license plates that would later be tracked by every camera along the route. She made no apparent effort to switch cars or alter her appearance between the two killings. She simply drove from one house to the next, as if she were running errands. The question of motive remains partially unanswered. Sheriff Wells said during his press conference that the Bradenton victim was owed approximately $4,000 in child support by Avalon, and that she faced a potential driver's license suspension if the balance was not paid. Whether that financial pressure was the trigger, or whether the killings were the result of something older and deeper, has not been established through public statements or court filings. Avalon's prior arrests for child abuse and custody-related disputes suggest a pattern of conflict with both ex-husbands that stretched across years and state lines. The shootings may have been the final expression of grievances that had been accumulating for a very long time. As of the most recent public reporting, Susan Avalon remains in custody. The Manatee County case is moving toward trial with the possibility of the death penalty. The Tampa case is being handled separately, with charges still being coordinated between the Tampa Police Department and the Hillsborough County State Attorney's Office. If convicted in both jurisdictions, Avalon would face sentences in two separate counties for two separate murders committed on the same day. The names of both victims have been withheld from public disclosure under Marsy's Law, a Florida constitutional amendment that protects the identities of crime victims. Because of this, nearly all the public reporting on the case refers to the victims only by their relationship to Avalon. The first ex-husband, the second ex-husband. Two men reduced to the roles they once held in her life, even in death. Their names, their histories, the details of who they were outside of their connection to Susan Avalon remain largely out of the public record. What is known is that both of them opened their doors on a Wednesday in December and did not survive the afternoon. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to Tallahassee, Florida, where a well-known law professor pulled into his garage on a July morning in 2014 and was shot in the head. His ex-wife was never charged, but her mother, her brother, and 3 other people were all convicted. The question of who ordered the killing took 11 years and 5 trials to answer. Case 5. The Adelson family and the murder of Dan Markel. Benton Hills is one of the older residential neighborhoods in Tallahassee, Florida, a canopy of live oaks and magnolias draped over brick ranch homes and mid-century cottages set back from narrow roads. It sits northeast of the Florida State University campus, close enough that professors sometimes walk to work. Daniel Eric Markel was one of those professors. He was 39 years old, a tenured member of the law faculty at Florida State, a legal scholar whose work on criminal justice and punishment theory had earned him a national reputation. He was born in Montreal, raised in Toronto, educated at Harvard and Cambridge, and had settled in Tallahassee because the university offered him a position that let him do the kind of work he cared about. On the morning of Friday, July 18, 2014, Markel dropped his 2 young sons off at preschool, went to the gym, and drove home. He pulled his black Honda Accord into the garage of his house on Trescott Drive. As he sat behind the wheel, someone approached the open garage and shot him in the head. A neighbour heard the shots and called 911. Paramedics arrived and transported Markel to Tallahassee Memorial Hospital, where he was placed on life support. He never regained consciousness. He was pronounced dead the following day, July 19, 2014. The Tallahassee Police Department and the FBI launched a joint investigation. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, pulled surveillance footage from nearby homes and businesses, and began tracing cell phone records and GPS data. Within days, investigators identified a vehicle of interest, a light-coloured Toyota Prius, that had been spotted near Markel's home on the morning of the shooting and also during a previous visit to the neighborhood about 6 weeks earlier. The car had been rented in South Florida, more than 400 miles away. The trail from the Prius led investigators south to Miami and into the orbit of a family named Adelson. Dan Markel had married Wendy Adelson in 2006. They met through a Jewish dating service and moved to Tallahassee together. Wendy, also an attorney, took a position as a clinical law professor at Florida State, specializing in child advocacy. Her family was based in South Florida. Her father, Harvey Adelson, and her brother, Charlie Adelson, were dentists who ran a successful practice called the Adelson Institute in the Fort Lauderdale area. Her mother, Donna Adelson, was the family matriarch, deeply involved in every aspect of her children's lives. The marriage between Dan and Wendy deteriorated after their 2 sons were born. Wendy later described the relationship as one in which she felt Dan did not view her as an equal. Dan had his own grievances. The couple divorced in 2013 after a bitter legal battle that centered almost entirely on one question: where would the children live? Wendy wanted to move back to South Florida to be near her family. Dan refused. He was established in Tallahassee. His career was there. He did not want his sons growing up 400 miles away from him. A judge ruled in Dan's favor. The children would remain in Tallahassee, and the parents would share custody on a 50-50 basis. The ruling was a defeat for the Adelsons. According to prosecutors, it was a defeat that Donna Adelson in particular could not accept. Court records and trial testimony painted a picture of Donna Adelson as a controlling figure who had strong opinions about every decision in Wendy's life, from her career to her relationships to the purchase of a home. Donna had been involved in the marriage from the beginning, and her dislike of Dan Markel grew as the divorce progressed. Dan had filed a motion in 2014 to prevent Donna from having unsupervised visits with the children, alleging that she routinely made disparaging remarks about him in front of his sons. The motion was pending at the time of his murder. Prosecutors alleged that Donna Adelson and her son Charlie devised a plan to eliminate Dan Markel so that Wendy could relocate to South Florida with the children. The plan involved multiple layers of intermediaries. Charlie Adelson was in a personal relationship with a woman named Catherine Magbanua. Magbanua, in turn, was the mother of 2 children fathered by a man named Sigfredo Garcia. Garcia was a childhood friend of another man named Luis Rivera. According to prosecutors, Charlie Adelson used Magbanua as a go-between to hire Garcia and Rivera for the killing. The price was $100,000. Rivera and Garcia made 2 trips from South Florida to Tallahassee. The first, in early June of 2014, appeared to be a reconnaissance mission. They drove to Markel's neighborhood and familiarized themselves with his routines. The second trip, on July 18th, was the one that ended with Markel being shot in his garage. Cell phone records, toll booth data, rental car agreements, and GPS tracking placed both men in Tallahassee on both occasions. Rivera would later testify that Garcia was the one who pulled the trigger. After the shooting, Garcia called Magbanua. It was the first call he made. Investigators documented a surge of phone activity between Magbanua, Garcia, and Charlie Adelson in the hours and days that followed. Financial records showed that Magbanua received large payments from the Adelson family in the months after the murder, money that prosecutors said was compensation for brokering the hit. Despite the evidence, it took years to bring charges. The case was complex, layered with intermediaries and built largely on circumstantial and digital evidence. Luis Rivera was the first to break. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 2016 and agreed to testify against the others. His cooperation was secured in exchange for a 19-year prison sentence. Sigfredo Garcia and Catherine Magbanua were tried together in October of 2019. Garcia was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy and sentenced to life in prison. The jury could not reach a verdict on Magbanua. The vote was reportedly 10-2 in favour of conviction. A mistrial was declared on her charges. Magbanua was retried in 2022. This time the jury convicted her of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation of murder. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 2 consecutive 30-year terms. Charlie Adelson was arrested in April of 2022 and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation. His trial took place in the fall of 2023. The prosecution presented evidence including undercover recordings, financial records, and testimony from Rivera and others. Charlie's defense team argued that Garcia and Rivera had acted on their own after learning through Magbanua that Charlie was unhappy with Markel, and that they carried out the killing without his authorization and then extorted him for payment. The jury did not accept that argument. On November 6, 2023, Charlie Adelson was convicted of all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 60 years. The final domino fell on the evening of November 13, 2023, 1 week after Charlie's conviction. Donna Adelson was arrested at Miami International Airport. She and her husband Harvey had booked one-way tickets to Vietnam, a country that has no extradition treaty with the United States. Authorities intercepted her before she could board the flight. She was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation of murder. Donna Adelson's trial began on August 22, 2025, in Leon County Circuit Court. The prosecution alleged that Donna was the driving force behind the entire plot, the person who first proposed eliminating Dan Markel and who pushed her son Charlie to arrange it. Prosecutors cited recorded jailhouse phone calls between Donna and Charlie, made after his conviction, in which he discussed suicide and plans to flee the country. Wendy Adelson, who testified at both her brother's and her mother's trials, maintained that she had no knowledge of the plot. She has never been charged, though prosecutors have named her as an unindicted co-conspirator. On September 4, 2025, Donna Adelson was convicted of all 3 counts. She gasped and sobbed when the verdict was read. At her sentencing on October 13, 2025, she stood before Circuit Judge Stephen Everett and insisted on her innocence. She told the court she had never received a parking ticket in her life and could not believe she was being sent to prison for a crime she did not commit. Judge Everett interrupted her multiple times, warning that her statements reflected what he described as an utter lack of remorse. He sentenced her to life in prison without parole for the murder charge, plus an additional 30 years for the conspiracy and solicitation counts, to be served consecutively. Donna Adelson was 75 years old at the time of sentencing. She became the 5th and final person convicted for their role in the murder of Dan Markel. Her husband, Harvey Adelson, sat in the front row during the hearing and addressed the judge himself, accusing the court and jury of bias. He has not been charged. Wendy Adelson relocated to Miami with the couple's 2 sons after the murder. She has built a life there, working and raising the boys who lost their father when they were toddlers. Prosecutors have said publicly that the investigation is not finished. When asked whether Wendy might face charges, one prosecutor responded with 2 words: "Stay tuned." As of mid-2026, no charges have been filed against her. The Dan Markel case is unusual among the cases in this discussion because the ex-wife herself has not been convicted or charged with a crime. The people who arranged and carried out the killing were her family members and their associates, acting, according to prosecutors, on a motive that was rooted in the custody dispute between Wendy and Dan. The murder was committed so that Wendy could move her children to South Florida. That was the goal. Whether Wendy knew about the plan, participated in it, or benefited from it without knowledge remains legally an open question. Dan Markel's parents, Ruth and Phil Markel, have spoken publicly about their son's death at multiple hearings and in media interviews. They live in Canada and attended the sentencing proceedings remotely via video link. They have described the loss of their son as something that reshaped every part of their lives. They have also described the frustration of watching an 11-year legal process unfold across 5 separate trials, each one revealing another layer of a plot that began with a custody dispute and ended with a contract killing. On the day he was murdered, Dan Markel was doing what he did every Friday morning. He dropped his boys off at school, he went to the gym, he came home, he pulled into his garage. The garage door was open, the neighbourhood was quiet. The man who shot him had driven 400 miles to be there, and when it was done, he got back in the rented Prius and drove 400 miles home. The entire operation, from the first phone call to the final payment, involved 5 people, 2 trips, and $100,000. All of it set in motion because a grandmother in South Florida wanted her daughter and her grandchildren closer to home and could not accept a judge's ruling that said no. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes place on a dark dirt road in Carlsbad, California, where a man was lured out at 11 at night with the promise of documents he would want to see. His estranged wife was watching from the shadows. Her shooting instructor was behind the rifle. Case 6. Diana Lovejoy. Carlsbad sits along the coast of northern San Diego County, a city of beach neighborhoods and lagoons and gated communities built into the hillsides above Interstate 5. It is wealthy, quiet, and orderly. The median household income runs well above the national average. The schools rank among the best in the state. The downtown has the kind of restaurants where people make reservations and the kind of shops where nothing on the rack has a clearance tag. It is not a place that generates a lot of police reports. Most of the problems in Carlsbad are the kind that get resolved through lawyers, not through violence. That distinction mattered in the case of Diana Lovejoy because her problem started with a lawyer and ended with a rifle. Diana Lovejoy was in her late 30s when she married Greg Mulvihill. The marriage was her second. They had a son together, a boy who became the center of both their lives and eventually the center of the fight that consumed everything else. The relationship deteriorated quickly. By the time the divorce proceedings began, the couple had stopped communicating in any productive way. The legal battle that followed was, by the account of San Diego County prosecutors, one of the most toxic divorces they had encountered. During the proceedings, Lovejoy made allegations against Mulvihill that were severe. She accused him of sexually abusing their young son. She also accused him of sexually abusing her. The allegations were investigated. They were not substantiated. A court evaluator found that Lovejoy had a pattern of escalation, of making accusations designed to gain leverage in the custody dispute, rather than to report genuine harm. The court reversed an earlier custody arrangement and awarded primary custody of the boy to Mulvihill. Lovejoy was granted limited visitation, 10 hours a week, 1 day at a time. She was also ordered to sell the family home in Encinitas, a coastal community just south of Carlsbad, and to pay Mulvihill $120,000 from the proceeds. The payment was due in the fall of 2016. The ruling hit Lovejoy on every front simultaneously. She lost primary custody of her son. She lost the house. She owed her ex-husband a 6-figure payment she did not have the means to cover. Her career had stalled. Her finances were unraveling, and the legal system she had tried to use as a weapon against Mulvihill had turned around and struck her instead. Every accusation she had made about him had been dismissed or discredited. Every strategy she had employed had failed. She was, by the summer of 2016, a woman who had run out of legal options and was about to run out of money. Sometime during the period between the custody reversal and the due date on the payment, Lovejoy began taking shooting lessons. Her instructor was a man named Weldon McDavid Jr., a former Marine Corps firearms trainer from Oceanside, a military town about 20 miles north of Carlsbad. McDavid was experienced. He had spent 12 years in the Marines, including time as an instructor at the School of Infantry. He knew weapons the way a mechanic knows engines. By the standards of anyone who handles firearms professionally, he was an expert. The lessons became something more. Lovejoy and McDavid began a romantic relationship. She confided in him about the custody battle, the court ruling, and the financial burden she was facing. She told him about Mulvihill. She told him about the abuse allegations, framing them as things that had actually happened, rather than claims that had been investigated and rejected. McDavid listened. According to prosecutors, he did more than listen. He offered to help. The nature of that help would become the central question at trial. Prosecutors said Lovejoy hired McDavid to kill Mulvihill. They said the price was $2,000. They said the plan was to lure Mulvihill to an isolated location, shoot him, and make it look like something other than what it was. The defense, in both Lovejoy's case and McDavid's, told different versions of what happened on the night of September 1st, 2016. But neither version disputed the basic facts of the evening. On that night, Mulvihill received a communication offering him documents related to the custody case, documents he would supposedly want to see. The message directed him to a specific location, a remote access road off Avenida Soledad in Carlsbad. It was dark. The road was unlit, bordered by scrub brush and open land, the kind of place where nobody would be around at 11 o'clock at night, the kind of place a person would only go if they had a reason. Mulvihill drove to the location. He parked and got out of his car. He was carrying a flashlight. According to Rivera's account of the Markel killing, hitmen sometimes relied on targets following routine. Here, the setup was more direct. Mulvihill had been told to come. He came. McDavid was already in position with a rifle. The shot struck Mulvihill under his left armpit and exited through his back. The bullet missed his vital organs, but the wound was serious. He went down. He was bleeding. He managed to get himself back to his car and call for help. Paramedics arrived and transported him to a hospital. He survived. Lovejoy was present at the scene. She had accompanied McDavid to the ambush site. She was not the one who pulled the trigger, but she was there, in the darkness, watching as the man she had been married to was shot on a dirt road at 11 o'clock at night. The investigation moved quickly. Mulvihill told detectives what had happened. He described the message that had lured him to the location. Investigators traced the communication back to Lovejoy. They interviewed McDavid, who initially denied involvement. They examined phone records, financial transactions, and the timeline of Lovejoy and McDavid's relationship. They established that Lovejoy had been taking shooting lessons from McDavid, that the two were romantically involved, and that the lure used to bring Mulvihill to the ambush site had been crafted by or at the direction of Lovejoy. There was also a detail from the year before the shooting that would surface during the trial. Lovejoy had asked her aunt whether she knew anyone who could scare or kill her husband. The aunt testified to this conversation. It placed the intent well before the night of the shooting, suggesting that Lovejoy had been thinking about eliminating Mulvihill for months, possibly longer, and had approached at least one person about it before settling on McDavid. Another piece of the case involved McDavid's role in the custody dispute itself. Prosecutors alleged that Lovejoy had paid McDavid $2,000 to provide false testimony in the custody proceedings, specifically to tell the court that Mulvihill had abused Lovejoy and the child. The payment was characterised by prosecutors as both compensation for the fabricated testimony and an advance on the murder contract. The two acts, the false testimony and the later shooting, were connected in the prosecution's framing as parts of a single campaign to destroy Mulvihill, first through the courts and then through violence. Lovejoy and McDavid were tried together. The trial began in the fall of 2017 in a San Diego County courtroom in Vista, California. The charges against both defendants included conspiracy to commit murder and premeditated attempted murder. The prosecution built its case around the documented timeline, the lure to the dirt road, the aunt's testimony about Lovejoy asking for someone to scare or kill her husband, the financial transactions, and the physical evidence linking McDavid's rifle to the shooting. McDavid's defense took an unusual approach. His attorneys argued that McDavid, as a former Marine marksman, could easily have killed Mulvihill if he had wanted to. The fact that Mulvihill survived, they said, proved that McDavid was not trying to kill him. He was only trying to scare him. McDavid himself reinforced this argument during the trial, saying from the stand that he had been aiming for the flashlight in Mulvihill's left hand, not for his body. He said the shot was an aiming error. He told the court that if he had intended to kill Greg Mulvihill, the man would be dead. The prosecution responded simply. McDavid was a hired gunman who had missed his mark. The fact that Mulvihill survived was luck, not intent. Lovejoy did not testify in her own defense. Her attorneys argued that she was not capable of the crime, that the evidence against her was circumstantial, and that McDavid had acted on his own motivations. But the jury had the aunt's testimony, the financial records, the phone data, and the documented pattern of escalation across the custody dispute. They also had a jury forewoman who would later summarize the verdict in plain terms. She told the San Diego Union Tribune that Lovejoy did not want to share custody and did not want to pay $120,000 to her husband. Those two facts explained everything the jury needed to understand. On November 13, 2017, the jury returned guilty verdicts against both defendants on all counts. When the verdict was read, Lovejoy appeared to be overcome. She lost consciousness in the courtroom and collapsed. She was attended to by a television reporter who happened to be seated nearby, and paramedics wheeled her out on a gurney. Observers in the courtroom told reporters that she appeared to have gone into shock. Sentencing took place in early 2018. McDavid was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. The sentence reflected the court's assessment of his role as the shooter, the person who had positioned himself with a rifle and fired a round into a man standing on a dark road. Lovejoy was sentenced to 26 years to life. The court credited her as the architect of the plan, but noted that she had not been the one who pulled the trigger. Lovejoy was 44 years old when she entered the California Institution for Women in Chowchilla, the same facility where Betty Broderick spent the final decades of her sentence. Both women arrived at the same prison for crimes rooted in the same core dynamic: a divorce, a custody dispute, a financial settlement that felt like punishment, and a decision, made in the space between losing a legal fight and accepting the loss, to solve the problem with a weapon instead of an appeal. The $120,000 payment that Lovejoy owed Mulvihill was due weeks after the shooting. Had the ambush succeeded, she would not have had to pay it. She also would have regained custody of her son, since the person the court had placed the child with would have been dead. The math was blunt. Kill Mulvihill, keep the money, get the child back. Prosecutors framed it in exactly those terms, and the jury accepted the framing. Greg Mulvihill survived. The bullet wound healed. He retained custody of his son. He later spoke publicly about the experience, describing the night on the dirt road and the long recovery that followed. He carried the physical scar of the shooting and the psychological weight of knowing that the mother of his child had stood in the darkness and watched as someone tried to end his life. McDavid appealed his conviction. Lovejoy appealed hers. Both appeals were denied. As of the most recent public records, both remain incarcerated. Lovejoy will be eligible for parole consideration after serving the minimum of her sentence, which places her earliest possible release date somewhere in the early 2040s. She will be in her 70s. The lure that brought Mulvihill to the dirt road that night was simple: documents related to the custody case, papers he would want to see, a reason to drive to an isolated location after dark, alone, without telling anyone where he was going. The trap worked because it was built on something real. Mulvihill was engaged in a custody fight. There were documents, there were hearings, there were filings he needed to review. The message exploited that reality and used it to place him on a dark road in the middle of nowhere, at the exact time and place where a man with a rifle was waiting for him. The distance between a legal strategy and a criminal one is supposed to be wide. Courts exist to resolve disputes without violence. Lawyers exist to channel anger into arguments that a judge can evaluate under rules that both sides have agreed to follow. In the Lovejoy case, that distance collapsed. The same dispute that had been argued in depositions and custody hearings and court filings was ultimately argued with a rifle on a dirt road at 11 o'clock at night. The setting changed, the intent did not. Lovejoy wanted to win. She had tried to win in court and lost. So she found a man with the training to do what the legal system would not, and she brought him to a place where the only witnesses were the scrub brush and the dark. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From Southern California, the next case moves to a small town in northwest Iowa called Early, where a woman shot a 20-year-old neighbor 9 times in her home, and then went on national television to say she had done it in self-defense. It took investigators 10 years to prove otherwise, and when they did, the reason behind the killing turned out to be a custody fight with an ex-husband living 1,000 miles away. Case 7, Tracy Richter. Early, Iowa, is the kind of town that fits inside a few blocks. It sits in Sac County, in the northwest corner of the state, surrounded by fields that stretch flat to the horizon in every direction. The population hovers around 500. There is a grain elevator, a volunteer fire department, a small school, and a handful of churches. People know each other by name. They know whose truck is parked where, and whose dog got loose, and whose kids are doing well in school. When something happens in Early, everyone hears about it by the next morning. On the night of December 13th, 2001, something happened that the town would talk about for the next decade. A woman named Tracy Richter called 911 to report that 2 men had broken into her home at 105 West South Avenue. She said they had attacked her. She said one of them had tried to strangle her with a pair of pantyhose. She said she had fought back. She said she had shot one of the intruders to protect herself and her 3 children who were in the house at the time. The second intruder, she said, had fled. When officers arrived, they found the body of a 20-year-old man named Dustin Wadey lying in a hallway of the home. He had been shot 9 times with 2 different handguns. Tracy Richter had a red mark on her neck that she said was from the strangulation attempt. Her 3 children, including her eldest son Bert, who was about 11 at the time, were in the house during the shooting. Richter appeared on local and then national television in the days that followed, describing the harrowing home invasion and presenting herself as a mother who had done what she had to do to save her family. The story held for a while. Dustin Wadey was a quiet young man who lived nearby. His mother, Mona Wadey, described him as withdrawn but kind-hearted, someone who was interested in computers and electronics and who kept mostly to himself. He had done some work for Richter's second husband, Michael Roberts, who ran a small computer business from the house. Wadey was familiar with the household. He was not a stranger to the family. The idea that he had broken in as part of a random home invasion struck some people as odd from the beginning, but Richter's account was detailed and consistent, and without contradicting evidence, investigators had limited grounds to challenge it. Tracy Richter had arrived in Early a few years earlier, in 1998, when she married Michael Roberts and moved to town with her son Bert from a previous marriage. Her first husband was John Pittman III, a plastic surgeon living in Virginia. The marriage to Pittman had ended in divorce, and the custody dispute that followed was bitter and protracted. Pittman wanted more time with Bert. Richter wanted to maintain primary custody and control. The two fought over the boy in court for years, and by December of 2001, the battle was approaching a critical hearing. Pittman had made his intentions clear. He was seeking sole custody. If he succeeded, Richter would lose her son. That timeline would later become the key to the entire case. Inside Dustin Wadey's car, investigators found a pink spiral notebook. The notebook was handwritten in Wadey's handwriting and appeared to be a journal of sorts. In it, Vader described being hired by a man he identified only by initials that corresponded to John Pittman. According to the notebook, this man had paid Wadey to break into Richter's home and harm her and her son as part of a scheme to gain custody. The notebook, if taken at face value, suggested that Richter's ex-husband had orchestrated the home invasion and that the attack was part of a custody plot gone wrong. Investigators kept the notebook's existence secret. They did not disclose it publicly, and they did not share its contents with the media or with Richter's defense. The reasoning, as detectives later testified, was straightforward. Whoever knew about the notebook's contents and could describe them accurately had knowledge of the crime. If Richter mentioned the notebook without being told about it, that would be significant. For nearly a decade, the case sat in a kind of limbo. Richter was not charged. She continued to maintain her self-defense account. She and Michael Roberts eventually divorced in 2008, and Richter moved to Omaha, Nebraska, returning to her maiden name. During those years, Mona Wadey attempted to file a wrongful death lawsuit against Richter, believing that her son had been lured to the house and killed, not shot during a genuine break-in. Investigators asked Wadey to hold off on the lawsuit, telling her it could interfere with an ongoing case. She reluctantly agreed. She waited. The years passed. In 2009, a new team of investigators went back to the house on West South Avenue to reconstruct the shooting. They examined bullet trajectories, blood spatter patterns, and the physical layout of the rooms where the shooting took place. What they found did not match Richter's story. She had told investigators and television audiences that Wadey was getting up, moving toward her, when she fired the final shots. The forensic reconstruction showed that Wadey's head was on the ground when the last rounds were fired. He had been lying down, not getting up. The shots that struck him in the head were fired downward into a person who was already on the floor. There was another detail that had quietly troubled investigators from the beginning. Richter had fired 9 shots out of 10, using 2 separate handguns in the dark without her glasses. She connected on 9 of those 10 rounds. For someone without formal firearms training, that level of accuracy under those conditions was, as the Sac County prosecutor later put it, exceptional. It did not look like panic, it looked like something else. The investigation accelerated in 2010 and 2011 after Ben Smith, a newly elected county attorney, took office and began reviewing cold cases. Smith pulled the Wadey file and saw what earlier investigators had seen but had not been able to act on. He also gained access to new witness statements. The most important came from a woman named Mary Higgins, who had been one of Richter's closest friends in Early. Higgins had been interviewed by investigators shortly after the shooting, back in early 2002. At that time, she said little of substance. She later explained that she had been afraid for herself, afraid for her family, afraid of what the notebook might mean and where the case might lead. She did not tell investigators about the notebook during that first interview because she assumed they already knew about it and because they did not ask. Years later, in a second round of interviews, Higgins told a different story. She said that sometime in January or February of 2002, after Richter returned from a family vacation in Australia, the two women sat down together. Richter described the shooting to Higgins in a way that struck her as deeply strange. There was no emotion in the telling. Higgins said it was like listening to someone recite a grocery list. Richter walked through the events matter-of-factly, describing how she had fired at Vader, how she had stepped over what she thought was dirty clothes in the hallway, how she had checked on the children. At one point, Richter described standing over Vader as he lay on the floor. She said she told him to stop moving. Then she fired the final shot into the back of his head. Richter also told Higgins about the pink notebook. She said police had found it in Vader's car and that it would prove her ex-husband, John Pittman, was behind the attack. This was the detail investigators had been protecting for years. Richter knew about the notebook. She knew what it said. She described its contents to her friend months after the shooting, at a time when only the person who had created or directed the writing of the notebook could have known what was in it. The trap closed slowly. Higgins eventually told investigators everything. Her testimony became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Richter was arrested in July of 2011 in Omaha and charged with first-degree murder. She was extradited to Iowa to stand trial. The trial began in October of 2011 in Webster County District Court in Fort Dodge, about 90 miles east of Early. The change of venue was granted because the case was too well known in Sac County to assemble an impartial jury. Prosecutor Doug Hammerin laid out the state's theory in detail. Richter had lured Dustin Wadey to her home. She had forced or persuaded him to write the contents of the pink notebook, a fabricated account designed to make it look like her ex-husband had hired Wadey to attack her. Once the notebook was written, Richter killed Wadey to keep him from talking. She then staged the scene to look like a home invasion, inflicted the mark on her own neck to simulate strangulation, and called 911. The motive, prosecutors argued, was the custody hearing. If Richter could make it appear that Pittman had hired someone to kill her and her son, the custody fight would be over. No court would grant custody to a man accused of ordering a hit on his own child. The notebook was the planted evidence. Wadey was the disposable witness, and the whole scheme depended on Wadey being dead, because a dead man cannot tell anyone he was forced to write a fake journal. John Pittman testified during the trial. He said he had never met Dustin Wadey. He said he had nothing to do with the notebook. He said he had not hired anyone to harm his ex-wife or his son. When the prosecutor asked him whether Tracy Richter despised him, Pittman responded with a short laugh and said he thought so. Richter's eldest son, Bert, now 21, took the stand for the defense. He gave detailed testimony about the night of the shooting, describing the break-in, the attack on his mother, and the gunfire. He said he saw Vader on the ground and starting to get up before his mother shielded him and told him to go to his room. He closed the door. He heard her tell Vader to stay down. Then he heard the final shot. Bert's testimony was compelling. Prosecutors later acknowledged that he was a strong witness for the defense, but his account conflicted with the forensic evidence about the position of Vader's body when the final shots were fired, and it could not explain how his mother knew about the contents of a notebook that investigators had kept secret for nearly a decade. Richter did not testify. Her defense rested on the self-defense claim and on Bert's account of the night. The jury was not persuaded. On November 7, 2011, Tracy Richter was found guilty of first-degree murder. She buried her face in her arms on the defense table when the verdict was read. Under Iowa law, which does not have a death penalty, the conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was sentenced on December 5, 2011. Michael Roberts, Richter's second husband, issued a public statement after the verdict. He said he hoped the conviction would allow him and his new wife to move forward after years of conflict with Richter. He had obtained custody of the 2 children from his marriage to her following her arrest. He asked people to pray for healing, for his children, for the Weedy family, and for what he called Richter's other victims, a phrase he did not elaborate on, but that suggested the damage extended further than the courtroom had explored. Mona Weedy, Dustin's mother, spoke after the verdict as well. She said there was still deep hurt left in her, even after a decade. Her daughter, Ashley Pingree, said the family could finally begin to move on because the truth was out in the open. Richter appealed her conviction. She argued that her trial counsel had been ineffective and that the evidence was insufficient to overcome her self-defense claim. The Iowa Court of Appeals upheld the conviction in January of 2013, finding that the forensic evidence, the testimony about the notebook, and the pattern of behavior documented by prosecutors constituted substantial evidence of guilt. Further appeals were denied. Richter remains incarcerated at the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women in Mitchellville. The Richter case took 10 years to prosecute. For most of that decade, the woman who killed Dustin Weedy walked free. She appeared on national television as a hero, a mother who had fought off intruders to save her children. She moved to another state. She divorced her second husband. She lived a life built on the foundation of a story that was, according to the jury that convicted her, a fabrication from start to finish. The pink notebook, the staged strangulation mark, the home invasion narrative, all of it was designed to win a custody fight with a man who lived 1,000 miles away and had no idea that a 20-year-old neighbor in a small Iowa town had been killed as part of a scheme to keep him from raising his own son. Dustin Weedy was 20 years old. He worked with computers. He had a huge heart, according to his mother. He did not know what he was walking into that night. Prosecutors acknowledged at trial that they could not say with certainty how Richter persuaded him to come to the house or to write the notebook. Whether she promised him money, companionship, or something else entirely was never established. What was established was that she selected him, used him, and then shot him 9 times to make sure he could never describe what had actually happened inside that house on West South Avenue. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to Southeast Texas, where a woman married 5 times and left a trail of dead and injured partners stretching across 3 states. Her 5th husband died in a hospital bed from what doctors initially thought was a diabetic episode. A detective who had been on the job for 6 weeks decided it looked like something else entirely. Case 8. Sarah Hartsfield. In January of 2023, a deputy at the Chambers County Sheriff's Office received a call from a hospital in Baytown, a city just across the county line. A 46-year-old man named Joseph Hartsfield had been admitted with dangerously low blood sugar. He was diabetic, he was in a coma, and the medical staff had flagged the case because something about his condition did not add up. Joseph Hartsfield had been brought to Houston Methodist Hospital on the evening of January 7th. His wife, Sarah Hartsfield, told hospital staff that she had found him unresponsive at their home in Beach City. She said she had called 911, though an affidavit filed later would note that she also told investigators she had waited approximately an hour before making that call. His blood sugar had dropped to a level that was immediately life-threatening. Doctors administered glucose, but his levels kept crashing. The standard interventions were not working. A nurse who treated him described his condition as a life-threatening illness that did not behave the way a normal diabetic episode should. Something external appeared to be driving his blood sugar down faster than the medical team could bring it back up. Joseph Hartsfield did not recover. He remained in the hospital for 8 days. He was pronounced dead on January 15, 2023. The Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences conducted an autopsy and determined that the cause of death was complications of the toxic effects of insulin. The manner of death was listed as undetermined, a classification that left the door open for further investigation. The case landed on the desk of a detective named Skylar Ross. She was 30 years old. She had been a detective for 6 weeks. In a later interview, She described the Hartsfield case as a once-in-a-lifetime assignment, the kind of investigation that most detectives never encounter in an entire career. Her direct supervisors were skeptical that there was a case to pursue. She was told she was beating a dead horse. She disagreed. She kept working. Sarah Jean Hartsfield was 50 years old. She was a former United States Army sergeant who had served roughly 20 years in the military. She had been married 5 times. Joseph was her most recent husband. They had met online and been married for 11 months at the time of his death. In the weeks before his hospitalization, their relationship had deteriorated. Joseph had recently returned to his hometown, opened a new bank account, and told family members he was planning to file for divorce. His relatives later told investigators that he was concerned for his safety. He believed Sarah might try to kill him. Roz began pulling phone records and digital evidence. What she found reshaped the scope of the investigation. On the morning of January 7th, hours before Joseph was hospitalized, a series of messages were sent from his phone to Sarah's. The messages contained his driver's license, a wedding photograph, bank account details for an account he had recently opened, and the key for his Apple Legacy contact, a feature that would allow Sarah to access his phone data after his death. Roz testified at trial that she believed Sarah had sent those messages from Joseph's phone to her own, assembling the documents she would need once he was gone. Data from Sarah's phone contradicted the account she had given to police. She told investigators that in the hours before Joseph's hospitalization, she had been asleep, sedated by a narcotic pain medication prescribed after a recent surgery. Her phone activity told a different story. She had been awake. She had been active on the device. The timeline of her phone use did not match the picture of a woman sleeping through a medical emergency unfolding in the next room. Detectives also found insulin pens on the nightstand beside Joseph's bed. The pens were not seized at the time, a decision that the lead investigator later said she regretted. The prosecution would argue that Sarah had administered a fatal dose of insulin to her diabetic husband, exploiting the fact that he already took insulin as part of his treatment. The overdose mimicked a natural complication of his disease, which is why the initial response was medical rather than criminal. Roz brought her findings to the Chambers County District Attorney, Cheryl Leek Henry, on February 3, 2023. Less than 3 weeks after Joseph's death, a grand jury indicted Sarah Hartsfield on a single count of murder. Judge Chap Kane issued an arrest warrant and set bond at $5 million. The indictment opened a window into Sarah Hartsfield's past that expanded the case far beyond Chambers County. Investigators and journalists began tracing her history across multiple states, and what emerged was a pattern that stretched back decades. Sarah had grown up in the foster care system. She described being sexually abused by a family member during childhood. She joined the army and served for roughly 2 decades, building a career that provided structure and stability. She married her first husband during her military service. That marriage ended. She married again. That marriage ended too. By the time she married Joseph Hartsfield in early 2022, she had been through 4 previous marriages, and the relationships that bookended them were marked by conflict, allegations of abuse, and, in at least 2 cases, violence. Her third husband, a man named James Donahue, provided some of the most striking testimony at trial. Donahue filed an affidavit in which he alleged that Sarah's 4th husband, David George, had told him that Sarah had been pressuring George for months to kill Donahue's new wife. According to the affidavit, Sarah had given George a pistol and told him she would not allow him to come home until the killing was done. George, in an interview conducted separately, confirmed that Sarah had made these demands, but said he never had any intention of following through. Sarah denied the allegations entirely. She was never charged in connection with the alleged plot. Donahue's new wife was not harmed, but the testimony introduced the idea, supported by a sworn statement from a former husband, that Sarah Hartsfield had attempted to orchestrate the murder of an ex-husband's new partner. There was also the matter of David Bragg. Bragg was a man Sarah had been engaged to after her 4th marriage ended. In May of 2018, she shot and killed him in Minnesota. She told investigators the shooting was self-defense. The local prosecutor reviewed the case and ruled it justified. Sarah was not charged. After her 2023 indictment for Joseph's murder, however, the Minnesota prosecutor reopened the Bragg case. A detective who worked the original investigation testified at the Texas trial that certain elements of Sarah's account had struck him as odd and abnormal, though he did not elaborate in detail. As of the trial, no new charges had been filed in Minnesota. There were also allegations of arson. In 2014, a fire destroyed a home in Missouri that Sarah's grandmother had given to her brother. The circumstances of the fire were suspicious. Sarah was discussed as a person of interest. She was never charged. Prosecutors at the Texas trial referenced the incident as part of a broader pattern, but acknowledged that none of the prior allegations, taken individually, could be used to prove she had killed Joseph Hartsfield. The trial began on September 29, 2025, in Chambers County. Jury selection produced a panel of 8 men and 4 women. Over 7 days of testimony, prosecutors laid out a case built on circumstantial and digital evidence. They presented phone records, deleted messages, movement data extracted from Sarah's devices, and medical testimony about the effects of insulin overdose. They argued that Sarah hated her husband, that he was planning to leave her, and that she exploited his diabetes to kill him in a way that would look like a natural complication of his disease. Assistant District Attorney Mallory Vargas told the jury in closing arguments that Sarah believed she would get away with it, because getting away with things was what she had always done. The defense argued that Joseph Hartsfield had caused his own death through poor management of his diabetes. His attorney pointed out that the medical examiner had listed the manner of death as undetermined, not homicide. He noted that Joseph was taking medications that made him more sensitive to insulin, and that a dangerous drop in blood sugar could occur without outside intervention. The defense asked the jury to consider that Sarah's difficult past, her childhood in foster care, the alleged abuse, her military service, did not make her a murderer. The jury deliberated for approximately 1 hour. On October 8, 2025, they returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase began the following day. Witnesses called by the prosecution included Sarah's own daughter, who testified that she had suffered abuse at her mother's hands. Joseph's mother described how her life had been permanently altered by her son's death. The prosecution emphasized the breadth of damage Sarah had inflicted across her relationships, not only on Joseph, but on the children and partners who had passed through her life over the decades. They argued she was incapable of acknowledging the pain she had caused and was unfit to return to any community. The defense asked the jury to consider Sarah's background, her time in foster care, the abuse she endured, her 20 years of military service, the fact that she was a mother of 4 children. They asked for a sentence that would allow her to eventually see those children again. On October 9, 2025, the jury sentenced Sarah Hartsfield to life in prison and a $10,000 fine. She will be eligible for parole after 30 years. She was 50 years old at the time of sentencing. After the sentence was read, Joseph's sister Jean stood and addressed the courtroom. She said she had initially liked Sarah. She described her as a master manipulator who had left behind a lasting trail of destruction. She looked at Sarah and told her directly that she had not defeated the family. They would keep Joseph alive in their memories. Sheriff Brian Hawthorne of Chambers County spoke to reporters outside the courthouse after the verdict. He praised the work of the district attorney's office and singled out Detective Roz, the woman who had been on the job for 6 weeks when the case arrived and who had refused to accept the initial assessment that Joseph Hartsfield had died of natural causes. Hawthorne said that without Roz's persistence, the case might never have been filed. The death could have been labelled as an illness. The insulin pens on the nightstand could have been overlooked. The phone records could have gone unexamined, and Sarah Hartsfield could have moved on, as she had moved on before, to whatever came next. 5 marriages, 2 dead partners, an alleged murder plot against a former husband's new wife, an arson investigation, a pattern of insurance inquiries and financial manoeuvring that surfaced at trial through text messages in which Sarah discussed her exit strategy and her husband's life insurance in the days before his hospitalization. The scope of the case extended well beyond Chambers County, and the full extent of the damage may not yet be known. What is known is that Joseph Hartsfield married a woman he met online, and 11 months later, he was dead in a hospital bed, killed by the same substance that was supposed to keep him alive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case returns to Oklahoma, where a woman and her lover staged a shooting in a garage to collect on a life insurance policy. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. Her trial became one of the most controversial in the state's history, and not because of the evidence. Case 9. Brenda Andrew. Oklahoma City spreads wide and flat across the center of the state, a grid of highways and strip malls and residential neighborhoods that bleed into one another without much fanfare. The northern suburbs are newer, built in the 1980s and 1990s as the city expanded outward from its downtown core. The houses are brick and siding, set on quarter-acre lots with two-car garages and backyard fences. The streets have names that evoke an idea of nature without actually being near any. Meadow Lane, Timber Ridge, Green Valley. It is the kind of place where families move because the schools are decent and the commute to the office is manageable. In November of 2001, one of those families lived in a house in the northeast part of the metro area. The family consisted of a man named Robert Andrew, his two young children, and his estranged wife, Brenda. They were separated. The divorce was in progress. But the logistics of two children and one house meant that the lines between together and apart had not yet been fully drawn. Robert Andrew was 39 years old. He went by Rob. He worked at a local business and was involved in the community through his church, where he and Brenda had been active members for years. The couple had been high school sweethearts. They married young, had children young, and built their adult lives in the orbit of their congregation. Friends and fellow church members described Rob as kind and steady. Brenda was more outgoing, more socially energetic. The marriage from the outside looked like one of those arrangements that had been set in motion early and kept going on momentum and routine. By the fall of 2001, the marriage was over in all but the legal formalities. Brenda had been having an affair with a man named James Darrell Pavat, a fellow church member who was more than a decade older than her. Pavat was married to someone else at the time. The affair had become an open secret within their social circle, and the exposure of it accelerated the collapse of both marriages. Rob filed for divorce. Brenda did not contest it. But the separation was not clean, and the financial and custodial details were still being sorted out when November arrived. One of the unresolved details was a life insurance policy. Rob Andrew had a policy worth roughly $300,000. Brenda was the named beneficiary. At some point during the separation, Rob told Brenda he intended to change the beneficiary. He wanted the payout to go to his children, not to his estranged wife. Whether he ever completed that change became a central issue in the case. According to prosecutors, Brenda knew the change was coming and understood that once it was finalised, her financial interest in Rob's death would disappear. The window was closing. On the evening of November 20th, 2001, Rob came to the house to pick up the children for a scheduled visitation. Before leaving, he went into the garage with Brenda. She told him the pilot light on the furnace had gone out and asked him to relight it. Rob went into the garage. While he was inside, he was shot twice with a shotgun. He died from his injuries. Brenda was also found with a gunshot wound. She had been struck in the arm by a single round from a .22 caliber firearm, a smaller weapon than the shotgun used to kill Rob. She told responding officers that an intruder had attacked them both. She described a break-in gone wrong, a stranger who had entered the garage and opened fire. She presented herself as a victim of the same attack that killed her husband. Investigators were skeptical from the start. The crime scene did not support the intruder theory. Nothing in the house had been taken. There were no signs of forced entry. The two weapons used in the garage, a shotgun and a .22, suggested two different acts rather than one chaotic event, and the wound on Brenda's arm drew particular attention. A prosecution witness later testified that the powder burns on her shirt and skin indicated the .22 had been fired at very close range, consistent with a self-inflicted injury or one staged to simulate an attack. The pattern did not match someone being shot by an assailant standing across a room or a garage. It matched someone holding a gun against their own arm and pulling the trigger. Detectives began looking at James Pavat almost immediately. Pavat had no alibi for the evening. His relationship with Brenda gave him a clear connection to the household. His willingness to help Brenda with the problems in her marriage had already been established through the affair. Investigators built a theory of the case in which Pavat was the shooter. He had entered the garage, fired the shotgun rounds that killed Rob, and then used the .22 to wound Brenda, creating the appearance of a shared attack. Alternatively, Brenda had wounded herself. Either way, the staging was designed to conceal the fact that this was a targeted killing carried out by two people who stood to gain from Rob's death. Brenda and Pavat were both arrested and charged with first-degree murder. They were tried separately. Pavat's trial came first. He was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy and sentenced to death by lethal injection. He was executed by the state of Oklahoma on December 3, 2015, maintaining his innocence to the end. In a final statement, he insisted that Brenda had no involvement and that he alone was responsible, though he did not admit to the shooting itself. His claim was contradicted by the prosecution's evidence, which showed coordinated planning between the two. Brenda Andrews' trial began in September of 2004 in Oklahoma County. It would become one of the most discussed and criticized criminal proceedings in the state's history, though not because of the evidence itself. The evidence was substantial. Prosecutors presented the insurance policy motive, the staged crime scene, the forensic analysis of the .22 wound, and testimony from witnesses who described the affair, the financial pressures of the divorce, and conversations in which Brenda discussed the insurance money. There was enough material to support the charges. What made the trial controversial was everything that surrounded the evidence. Prosecutors spent a significant portion of the trial focused on Brenda Andrews' personal life in ways that had little to do with the murder itself. They called former romantic partners to the stand and questioned them in detail about their sexual encounters with Brenda. They paraded items of her lingerie before the jury. They referred to her in open court as a slut puppy. They questioned her fitness as a mother. They scrutinized her clothing, her demeanor, and her behavior in contexts that had no direct connection to the events of November 20th, 2001. The message being delivered to the jury, as appellate judges later noted, was not simply that Brenda Andrew had committed a crime. The message was that she was a bad woman, a bad wife, a bad mother, someone whose personal failures were so extreme that they constituted a separate kind of offence. Dissenting judges at both the state and federal appellate levels would later describe the prosecution's strategy in stark terms. Oklahoma Judge Arlene Johnson wrote that much of the testimony served no purpose other than to hammer home that Brenda Andrew was a bad wife, a bad mother, and a bad woman, and that the effect was to trivialize the value of her life in the minds of the jurors. 10th Circuit Judge Robert Bacharach observed that the evidence of Brenda's infidelity lacked relevance and cast her as a woman fixated on seducing nearby men. He noted that prosecutors chose to open and close the trial with testimony about her sexual history, creating what he called an outsized effect due to the proximity of that material to the jury's deliberations. Despite these concerns, the conviction stood. Brenda Andrew was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The jury sentenced her to death. She became the only woman on Oklahoma's death row, a distinction she has held for more than 2 decades. The appeals process has been long and multi-layered. Brenda's attorneys have argued at every level that the trial was fundamentally unfair, that the prosecution used gender-based attacks to prejudice the jury, and that the evidence of her sexual history and personal life was admitted not because it was relevant to the murder, but because it painted her as a woman who deserved to be punished. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the conviction in a divided opinion in 2023. The majority found that while the trial was imperfect, it was fundamentally fair. The dissent disagreed, arguing that the cumulative effect of the prosecution's gender-focused strategy denied Brenda a fair proceeding. Rob Andrews' family has maintained throughout the appeals process that Brenda orchestrated the killing and that the evidence supports the verdict. They have described Rob as a devoted father who was trying to move forward with his life and protect his children's financial future. The insurance policy, they say, was the trigger. Once Rob announced his intention to change the beneficiary, Brenda's path to the money narrowed to a single option. The 2 children were young at the time of their father's murder. They lost their father that night in the garage. Their mother was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. Custody passed to relatives. The children grew up in a household shaped by the absence of both parents, one dead and one on death row. The damage radiated outward from the garage on that November evening and reached into lives that had no part in the decisions that led to it. Brenda Andrew remains on death row at the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center in McLeod, Oklahoma. She has been there since 2004. Oklahoma resumed executions in 2015 after a prolonged moratorium, and the state has carried out multiple executions in the years since. Brenda's case continues to move through the appellate system. Her attorneys have pursued every available legal avenue, arguing that the trial was tainted by prosecutorial misconduct and that the death sentence should be vacated. James Pavitt confessed to being the one responsible in his final moments, but he never provided a detailed account of what happened inside the garage. The physical evidence, the two different weapons, the staged wound on Brenda's arm, and the forensic testimony about powder burns told a story that his last words could not undo. Two people went into that garage with Rob Andrew on the evening of November 20th, 2001. Rob went in because Brenda asked him to help with the furnace. What he found inside was not a broken pilot light. The life insurance policy was worth $300,000. Brenda Andrew was still the named beneficiary on the night Rob was killed. Whether he had begun the process of changing it, whether the paperwork was sitting on a desk somewhere waiting to be filed, or whether he had only talked about making the change, the practical outcome was the same. He died before the change took effect. The money, under the terms of the policy, would have gone to Brenda. It did not, because she was arrested and charged with his murder before the claim could be processed. The payout she had counted on, the financial motive prosecutors placed at the centre of the case, never reached her. The insurance company held the funds. The children, the intended beneficiaries Rob never had the chance to formally designate, were left to grow up without either parent and without the money their father had tried to set aside for them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case leaves the United States entirely and travels to a small town in southeastern Australia, where a woman invited her estranged husband's parents, his aunt, and his uncle to a Saturday lunch. She served beef Wellington. The mushrooms inside it were not the kind sold at any grocery store. 3 of the 4 guests did not survive the week. The host told investigators it was a terrible accident. Her estranged husband, who had declined the invitation, later said under oath that he stayed away because he believed she would poison him. Case 10. Erin Patterson. The Ungatha is a small town in the Gippsland region of southeastern Australia, about an hour and a half southeast of Melbourne by car. The landscape is green and hilly, a patchwork of dairy farms and eucalyptus forest that rolls toward the coast. The town itself has a few thousand residents, a main street with a pub and a bakery, and the kind of atmosphere where people wave at one another from their cars. It is not the kind of place where anyone expects to read about a mass poisoning. On a Saturday afternoon in late July of 2023, a 50-year-old woman named Erin Patterson served lunch to 4 members of her estranged husband's family at her home in the area. By the following week, 3 of them were dead. The guests were Gail Patterson and Don Patterson, Erin's former parents-in-law, and Heather Wilkinson and Ian Wilkinson, Gail's sister and brother-in-law. Gail and Don were in their 70s. Heather was 66. Ian was 68. They had come for a meal. Erin had prepared beef Wellington, a dish that involved pastry wrapped around a filling that included mushrooms. The lunch was described as pleasant. The guests ate, visited for a time, and left. Within hours, all 4 of them began experiencing severe gastrointestinal symptoms: nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain. They were admitted to hospitals in the region and later transferred to larger facilities in Melbourne as their conditions worsened. The symptoms were consistent with poisoning by Amanita phalloides, commonly known as the death cap mushroom. Death caps are among the most lethal fungi on Earth. They contain toxins called amatoxins that attack the liver and kidneys, and there is no reliable antidote. A person who ingests a sufficient quantity will often feel better for a period after the initial symptoms subside, a deceptive lull that can last a day or more. Then the organ failure begins. By the time the damage becomes apparent in blood tests, it is frequently too late. Gail Patterson died on August 4, 2023, 9 days after the lunch. Don Patterson died the same day. Heather Wilkinson died on August 2nd. Ian Wilkinson, the only survivor, spent weeks in the hospital. He required emergency surgery, including the removal of part of his bowel. He recovered slowly and with lasting damage to his health. In a single meal, Erin Patterson had killed both of her estranged husband's parents, killed his aunt, and nearly killed his uncle. Erin Patterson and her husband Simon Patterson were estranged at the time of the lunch. They had been married for years and had 2 children together. The marriage had deteriorated, and although a formal divorce had not been finalised, the couple was living apart. Simon was not present at the lunch. He later testified, during proceedings that were not heard by the jury, that he had been explicitly invited but declined. His reason, stated under oath, was blunt. He said he did not attend because he believed there was a risk that Erin would poison him. That statement carried weight because of what investigators and prosecutors later alleged about the years leading up to the July 2023 lunch. According to evidence presented in pre-trial hearings and later unsealed after the trial, Simon Patterson told authorities that Erin had poisoned him on at least 3 separate occasions between 2021 and 2022. He described falling violently ill after eating meals she had prepared: a pasta bolognese, a chicken korma curry, a vegetable wrap. Each time the symptoms were severe enough to require hospitalization. One episode resulted in a coma, another required the surgical removal of part of his bowel. His personal physician testified about what he described as 3 near-death experiences. Medical professionals were unable to identify the exact cause at the time, but Simon grew suspicious of Erin well before the lunch that killed his parents. Prosecutors initially filed 3 additional counts of attempted murder against Erin Patterson related to these earlier alleged poisonings of Simon. Those charges were dropped without public explanation before her trial began. The decision meant the jury that would determine her guilt or innocence in the deaths of Gail, Don and Heather, and the near death of Ian, never heard the evidence about what Simon said had happened to him. The full scope of the allegations only became public after the trial, when a judge lifted a suppression order on the pre-trial transcripts. Erin Patterson was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. She pleaded not guilty to all charges. Her defense argued that she had purchased mushrooms from an Asian grocery store and had no knowledge that any toxic fungi were included among the ingredients she used. She said the lunch was an ordinary family gathering and that the poisonings were a tragic accident. She denied any intent to harm her guests. Prosecutors argued otherwise. They said Patterson had deliberately included death cap mushrooms in the meal, that she knew they were lethal, and that she had targeted her husband's family. Death cap mushrooms had been identified growing in the area around Leongatha. They are not uncommon in parts of southern Australia, where they were introduced decades ago and have since spread through suburban and rural landscapes, often growing near oak trees. The prosecution contended that Patterson had sourced the mushrooms locally and incorporated them into the beef Wellington with the intention of killing the people who ate it. The trial took place in a Victorian court in the spring of 2025. The proceedings lasted several weeks and drew intense media attention across Australia. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence, medical testimony, and the circumstances surrounding the lunch. They pointed to the estrangement between Erin and Simon as the context for the killings. They argued that Erin's relationship with Simon's family had become strained alongside the marriage, and that the lunch was not a gesture of reconciliation, but a vehicle for harm. The defence pushed back on every point. They challenged the forensic timeline. They questioned whether the prosecution could prove beyond reasonable doubt that Erin had knowingly introduced the toxic mushrooms into the food. They emphasised the absence of any direct evidence showing her handling or foraging for death caps. The case was largely circumstantial, built on the convergence of motive, opportunity, and the fact that Erin had prepared and served the meal that killed 3 people. In May of 2025, the jury returned its verdicts. Guilty on all 3 counts of murder. Guilty on the count of attempted murder. Erin Patterson showed little visible reaction as the verdicts were read. The courtroom, packed with members of both families and a large media contingent, was silent for a long moment before the proceedings continued. Under Victorian law, each murder conviction carries a maximum penalty of life imprisonment. The attempted murder charge carries a maximum of 25 years. Judge Christopher Beale scheduled the sentencing hearing for August 25, 2026, giving both the prosecution and defence time to prepare submissions. Victim impact statements are expected from a large number of family members and friends. The judge indicated he anticipated receiving many of them. Patterson's legal team announced their intention to appeal the convictions. The grounds for the appeal have not been fully detailed in public filings, but the defence has signalled that they intend to challenge the sufficiency of the evidence and aspects of how the trial was conducted. The unsealing of the pre-trial evidence about Simon Patterson's alleged poisonings added a dimension to the case that the jury never considered. If the allegations are accurate, the July 2023 lunch was not the first time Erin Patterson used food as a weapon. It was the culmination of a pattern that stretched back at least 2 years. A pattern in which her estranged husband was the initial target and his family became the final one. Simon himself said as much from the witness box during a closed hearing. He told the court that he had a lot to grieve and that the legal process had been very difficult, especially given that the charges related to his own poisonings had been dropped and his testimony about them was excluded from the trial. The 3 people who died at that lunch had no known conflict with Erin Patterson. Gail and Don Patterson were Simon's parents. Heather Wilkinson was Simon's aunt. They came to lunch at the home of their son's estranged wife because they were invited and because, apparently, they saw no reason to be afraid. Ian Wilkinson survived, but he spent weeks in a hospital bed with organ damage that required surgery and left permanent effects. He attended the lunch for the same reason the others did. A family member had asked them to come, and they said yes. The death cap mushroom is a particularly quiet instrument of harm. It does not taste unusual. It does not look dramatically different from several edible species. A person who eats one will not feel the effects for hours, sometimes not until the next day. The initial illness can be mistaken for food poisoning or a stomach virus. By the time liver failure sets in, the window for effective treatment has often closed. There is no reliable antidote. The toxins bind to enzymes in the liver and begin destroying cells in a process that, once advanced, cannot be reversed. A single mushroom cap can contain enough amatoxin to kill an adult. The 4 guests at Erin Patterson's table consumed the poison, left the house feeling fine, and did not understand what was happening to them until their bodies began to shut down. Leongatha went on with its routines after the arrests and the trial. The dairy farms kept operating, the pub stayed open, but the case left a mark on the town and on the broader Australian consciousness that has not faded. The image of a family lunch ending in mass death, of a table set with good intentions on one side and lethal fungi hidden inside the food on the other, is the kind of image that stays with people long after the headlines move on. 3 people sat down to eat a meal prepared by a woman they trusted enough to accept an invitation from, and they did not survive the week. Simon Patterson lost both of his parents on the same day. He lost his aunt 2 days before that. He nearly lost his uncle. And in the months that followed, evidence emerged suggesting that the same woman had tried to kill him too, using the same method, in the same kitchen, with the same quiet patience. He is alive because he stopped eating what she cooked. His parents were not that cautious. They had no reason to be. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.